Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We turn now in the Johnson edition to poem 280, I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. Now, this is one of those poems that has led a certain number of scholars, I think of Harold Bloom here, to say Emily is just so impossible to completely understand what it is that she's saying. How this poem is read is going to have a lot to do with how you orient yourself towards Emily Dickinson as a poet. In many ways, I like to think of this as Emily's depiction of the fall of Genesis 3. You'll remember in that classic story, and we've given lectures on it as we went through our Paradise Lost lectures at learnstrong.net. You'll remember that we pointed out that the word fall or the word sin does not occur one time in that passage of Genesis 3. And at the very conclusion, after the curses have been distributed and all of that, that whoever the deity figure is in that story, God or whatever, says now man has become as us, knowing good and evil. I think a question that Emily would have enjoyed and engaged in would be, are Adam and Eve more like God before they quote-unquote sin or after they quote-unquote sin? And notice that the focus is on the word knowing, right? And it will be significant here. In some ways, this is a great proleptic kind of poem, a foreshadowing of some possibilities to come. It is one of the most challenging and debated poems of Emily's entire corpus. Priest, the great scholar, said that this is anguish at its most extreme, and the great scholar Sewell said she seems as close to touching bottom as she ever got, end quote. And in a letter, Higginson said it this way, letter 261 of April the 25th, 1862, that Emily says to Higginson, quote, I had a terror since September I could tell to none, and so I sing as the boy does by the burying ground because I am afraid, end quote. The poem was actually published in 1896, but without the final stanza for reasons we'll obviously have to get into. And finally it was fully published in 1947 in the New England Quarterly. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already worked through our set of introductory comments, and I'm really hopeful for this study especially, that you've worked through the previous 279 poems. We just finished with 279, Tie the Strings to My Life. If you have been following, I think this is one of those poems that requires that you set it within all of the other poems of Emily Dickinson. In many ways, we are back to Emily's quest for knowledge. We are back, of course, to Republic 7 in the Cave allegory. We are back to the question of madness. We are back to self-analysis, as sometimes we'll reference it. Is it mental disorientation that we're talking about here? Farrar, the scholar, will see this as a fainting spell, and other scholars like Gordon will talk about Emily's epilepsy as being described here. We are in many ways back to what scholars call the fled subject of death and immortality, possibly. And the funeral here is the death of maybe her hopes for her love of Sam Boyle, some will say. In other words, she comes to this recognition that it's over between them, and therefore her poetic project will be the only thing she can ever truly, quote-unquote, know. The question really often of Emily's poetry is how to represent not mental illness so much as spiritual illness. And it is fascinating. The scholars believe this poem was actually not shown by Emily to anyone. It does follow, in many ways, scholars have pointed out, the traditional funeral format of the Congregationalist funeral. This is how she'll say it. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll. As all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence some strange race wrecked, solitary here, and then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. Now, I can understand why a poem like this would send a whole lot of readers saying, you know, give me Whitman, give me any number of other contemporaries, Longfellow, whatever, because this is a very, very problematic set of lines. By the way, when we get to to poem 937, she'll play the same game again. I felt a cleaving in my mind as if my brain had split. I tried to match it scene by scene, but could not make them fit. The thought behind I strove to join unto the thought before, but sequence rallied out a sound like balls up on a floor. Here, of course, it will be bells. Notice she'll begin with this idea of a funeral in her brain, and from brain we'll go to mind, and from mind we'll go to soul, and then, of course, ultimately to being itself. It's interesting the way she'll play the game. We've got mourners coming to and fro, and they keep treading. Notice the repetition of treading, treading, beating, beating, and then down, down, 3 times in the poem. Treading, treading. By the way, the word treading only gets used 1 time in all of her poetry. It's here. Till, notice her dance with till and then. Till it seemed, then I cannot help but think of Hamlet behind a whole bunch of this. Do you remember what Mama asks Hamlet in 1-2? Why does it seem so particular with these? Seem, madam, nay, not seems, but is. I have that within which passeth show, these but the trappings and the suits of woe. I think here she's playing the game of what is it like to fall? What is it like to begin to lose somehow cognitive collection, cognitive power? It's one option. That sense, notice, however, this is the opposite, and I actually read this poem as a victory poem. I don't read this poem as a sad and mournful and depressing poem at all. Notice her use of the word sense all of a sudden comes breaking through. Now, there's a lot that's been made of this. In other words, it's almost as if she's dead but not dead. And, of course, this will take us later to her most famous rendition of this, poem 712, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, and it kind of portrays this journey to the graveyard. And when, as opposed to then, it's coming, they all were seated, that is to say the mourners, a service, and then we'll get to this interesting simile, like a drum kept beating. The service is what's bothering her, till, second till, I thought, before it was seen to know I thought, and it will set us up for the word knowing at the end. My mind was going numb. Now, this use of the word numb, some have pointed out that it's like the word dumb, unable to speak. In other words, we've seen this already in our poetry, the power of understanding that there's certain things that are translinguistic. You just can't put words to them. And then, notice all the ands, and we'll have 12 of them, right? And she says, then, of course, the last word of the poem, I heard them lift a box. Notice I didn't see them lift a box. I heard them lift a box. Obviously, it's been referenced as the coffin. And creak across my soul. I think creak is the hinge word here. And I think that it's the only time it's used in all of her poetry is right here. And it's interesting that it's creaking across the soul, not the mind, not the brain. My soul with those same boots of lead again. Something maybe dragging her down, boots of lead. By the way, in poem 341, we'll have hour of lead. Then, the second then, space began to toll. And we're going to get to the bell thing here in a second. It's an opening of a kind. Now, some have seen this as a falling, which of course makes sense given what we're about to read. It's all the heavens were a bell. Again, another interesting use of that word as, the simile. And being, back to sense, but an ear, we're back to hearing. And I and silence, some strange race wrecked solitary here. Now, it is easy to take some of Emily's poems like this one and to put it next to certain kinds of contemplative practices, meditation practices, either in the Christian or the Buddhist tradition or in the Hindu tradition. And something similar is happening here, where it's a certain kind of power of silence. Notice she'll say, the silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary here. Now, the word wrecked, many have used as obviously shipwrecked. And then the third then. And then a plank in reason broke. Notice it's not faith, it's reason. In reason broke. And I dropped down and down, all these D words in this line, and hit. Now, again, some have seen this as her losing her mind. Some have seen this as her struggling with madness. But notice what she hits as she goes down, down, down a world, notice it is capitalized, at every plunge. And finished, capital F, knowing, dash, then, dash. Now, Emily's readers would obviously see the word finished capitalized and think of the words of Christ in John 19:30 when he says, according to have said, it is finished. I think this is a powerful representation of what it is like to know, to go on the quest to knowledge. Perspicacity has been our word here. And I think at 2a, her argument is that it is difficult, it is often painful. There is a loss, no doubt, but there is also, I think, a quest that ends with a rising, and the word then suggests it. And of course, knowledge requires a letting go, I think, is the other possible message here. At 3b, well, obviously the extended metaphor in the first three stanzas of the funeral is powerful, right? It is the external image of some kind of internal world, no doubt. We do have our 12 ands. The word choice here is interesting. The location of suffering going from brain to mind to soul to being. And then one scholar, Wolf, has pointed out, this language has an interesting way to kind of lure us in. We read it and we go, well, it's self-evident what's going on. And then we go, wait a minute, what really is going on here? At 3a, well, I can't help but think about this in one of the classic texts of Room 303, Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper, and the way in which, go back and take a look at what we've said about that in LearnStrong.net, the way in which that whole text can be re-understood because of its very end. Now, why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path, so I had to crawl across him every time. Exclamation point is the way that story ends. It's like, whoa, 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 what is this poem about? Well, there's a literal reading of a text, and then there's a figurative reading of the text. I'm suggesting a symbolic or figurative reading, obviously, of this text. Plato's Republic 7 comes to mind with cave allegory. Obviously, Milton's Paradise Lost, and the tie to Genesis 3, which in my estimation is what's really going on here. I think Emily is playing around a whole lot with the Genesis 3 motif. Finally, at 3b, obviously, you got to own this poem, guys. All I can do is kind of share it with you. That's why we call this Chats with Emily. How do you read this poem? Do you read this as a tragic poem? Do you read this as a discussion of potential madness or mental disorientation or spiritual illness? Or do you read this poem as rather a triumph, right? In the end, there's something powerful about finding new worlds as one plunges and come to some sense of knowing. Thank you.